Hello, everyone. I'm Daniela Fayer, Group Publisher for Defense at GovExec, and I'm delighted to continue the conversation today with Aaron Rosenmund. He is Pluralsight's Director of Security, Research, and Curriculum. Aaron, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I thought before we dive into a little Q&A, rapid fire, I would ask you to just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your role at Pluralsight, and kind of, your career path, how you got there.
Absolutely. So at Pluralsight, I'm essentially responsible for all of our cybersecurity content. I also am an author, so I have about 120 pieces of content that I've authored across a lot of different topics within cybersecurity on the platform as well. But part-time, I'm in the Air National Guard, so I'm currently at the 166 Cause in Delaware, and I'm a cyber warfare operations officer there. And before that, for the last 10 years, I was in Florida in the Air National Guard, building some of the first in-place cyber defense capabilities for the Air Force, really at large. So actually, I'm gearing up now. I run the largest red team of any DoD exercise in the world. It's 120 people this year for an event called Cyber Shield. And so if I seem extra stressed, it's because that's coming up next week. Yeah,
that's amazing. I really appreciate giving us some context because, we're going to talk a little bit today, and that background, makes you an expert on these things, even if you are a little stressed out. So let's get right to it. Aaron, what are you currently seeing as the biggest threat to the DoD and federal agencies' mission, in cyberspace, in that area?
Yeah, so avoiding talking about actual threats like other nations, of course, I think the biggest issue is skills pipeline, and not just the skills pipeline, but getting the talented people that we do actually have access to in the DoD and federal government to have access to impactful parts of the mission as quickly as possible, right? There's a training pipeline that doesn't necessarily account for your civilian experience, that in some cases up to 3 years long, depending on what your mission is. And so they get people effective within their first set of 4 years. They're not even mission capable for 3 years. And even then they have to do on the job training. So it just takes too long. You have to be able to be a bit more nimble than that.
Wow. I know we cover in our articles and our journalism a lot on talent acquisition and readiness. So along those lines, how can these agencies ensure that the most skilled professionals are available to respond to these cyber threats? Can you elaborate on that for us?
Well, I got to give a little bit of a pitch for the National Guard, right? So the civilians who come in, whether it be 2 weeks and a weekend, a year, that's what you generally think of. But in cybersecurity, I promise you, it's so much more than that. It's essentially half of our job is to go do as much support for the DoD as we possibly can. Now, there's a lot of concern because of the training pipeline and how that impacts the private part of your life, like what you're doing on the civilian side. And it's true. And so the better we can partner to bring in civilian experience, especially if it's through some program like the National Guard, let them be effective in as quick a amount of time as possible, and then get them back to their civilian jobs and allow that to be a rotational process where we can share knowledge back and forth. It's beneficial on both sides, right? I think that is our best way to keep people and talent that we need to be able to kind of dominate in the information space, right?
Great. And how about Pluralsight's efforts? Can you tell us a little bit about how Pluralsight is partnering with DoD agencies to help ensure that they're prepared to achieve information dominance, especially with the evolving threat landscape?
For sure. So on top of a number of places that we support and partner for things like Cyber Shield, we provide a full set of training that fully emulate our most current advanced persistent threats. And then they pay for my time to go be there and pay for some of our team to go be there and like run through emulations for those threats for 1,300 people at a time. So it's kind of like an all-year effort that Pluralsight's really heavily involved in. But again, leveraging the platform. So what we're trying to do and have always been trying to do is focus on the tools that the DoD members are using every day for cyber defense, as well as for cyber offense. But on the defensive side, a lot of those tools are aligned to the things that are used on the civilian side as well. And so what we can do and already do is structure things around the DCWF, or the DoD Cyber Workforce Framework, and structure our content around that, but then also really heavily focused on exactly what those missions are. So for instance, with the CPT missions, they're concerned with hunt forward. Now that Nagasoni's out, we'll see kind of what the new rotation is, but I don't expect that to change too much. But with the hunt forward mission, we can directly align our training in a way that looks consumable and makes sense for the components of a hunt forward mission. And same thing for the new smaller units, the CPTMDs that are coming up as well. So a lot of the training content that we have that's applicable for civilian industry is repackaged. And then in some cases, because it's not just me that is also part-time DoD on our team, I have research team members that are also in the DoD. We can then leverage that experience to get people what they need and then repackage that in consumable product for the DoD as well.
That's great. And for the DoD, I mean, where do you think the most work needs to be done in the DoD agencies to build their capabilities to ensure that they're competitive in the cyber domain? I mean, where do you see that they need to put in the most effort and work with industry to resolve?
There's been some really good progress, especially with some of the new work roles and work role IDs, the DCWF. Part of that is you have to get hands-on, right? And you have to have someone check off that you've done that hands-on capability before you're qualified in your work role. Now that makes sense, but right now isn't really fully aligned to the job that you necessarily came in to do with the Army or Air Force, or Marines, or Coast Guard, right? They're two separate things. So I'm a qualified capability developer, but my job is a cyber warfare officer, and they're two separate trainings, right? And so one of the big things we need to do is enable the DoD to have that hands-on space to be able to very quickly prove and check off sections of knowledge that they already have, as well as get practice with sections that they don't. So they can really quickly get mission capable or qualified in your work role to be able to then go beyond mission. So that's one of the big components. The other piece of that, and this is just because we have the stump here, is that there's policy issues with how quickly we can authorize missions and then execute on those missions, as well as with our staffing rotations, right? We're still kind of treating the cyber domain as if it's land or space or even sea, right? We have this like 6-month rotation. We're going to go get people ready to deploy, whatever it may be. And in this case, it's just completely different, but we don't need to do that. We don't need to go then get them into pre-deployment and get them over into the desert, into the EU now for that domain, or wherever the next domain is, whether it's PACOM. We don't need to do that, right? Instead, we need to be able to be, again, more nimble. If there's something coming up that we can execute on in 2 weeks, let's go get the people that we know. Let's have a skills inventory within the DoD of the people who are capable and qualified. Let's get them together very quickly. The pre-deployment can be online because, again, it's cyberspace. And then let's get spaces where they can do those missions that are regionally available to them. So they can go execute 2 weeks, go back home, you're good to go, right? Like, it needs to be just quite a bit more nimble, and our policy has to be able to be aligned to authorize that capability as well.
Aaron, you're so passionate, I can tell, about what you do. I could talk to you longer about this, and I wish we had more time, but we do not. So I want to thank you so much for being here with me today and for the important work that you're doing to help agencies achieve information dominance. Thank you to Pluralsight for helping make this event possible. I hope you'll stay with us for our next session. For Defense One, I'm Daniela Fayer. Thank you so much for tuning in today.